When the doors blew open, Tuesday died. Rain smashed the glass in a silver hiss, and a man the size of a doorway stumbled through, folded over himself like a pile of broken furniture. Mercy General's sliding doors kept flapping, spitting cold hallway air into the warm, bleach-scented ER. Nurses leaned away, fluorescent lights hummed. Blood spattered across the tile in a pattern that read like a warning. Unit 42, incoming. The radio crackled, thin, professional, distant, and then sound rushed in, the thud of boots, the rattle of a stretcher, a voice that wasn't afraid to clear a path. Someone shouted for a trauma bay. Brenda Miller barked orders so fast they blurred. Dr. Gregory Sterling appeared at the threshold with his coat collar up, eyes already calculating, triage in angles and decimals. He smiled like he owned the night shift, like he owned everyone who didn't. Aurora Jenkins felt the smile as a weight against her skin. She had been at Mercy General long enough to learn the rhythm of being small. She learned it in the way colleagues slid past her, the way Dr. Sterling's curiosity tasted like smirks, the way Brenda's pragmatism folded into sarcasm when there was no audience. Aurora's voice lived at the edge of the room. It was polite, thin, apologetic. Her hands were cool and steady where it mattered, adjusting IVs, checking vitals, tidying the edges of a patient before family could see the mess. But she moved as if she expected to be looked through rather than looked at, an unread file on a shelf someone might bump by accident. She kept a coin in the pocket of her scrub jacket, a small, worn thing, dull silver, a raised pattern smoothed by years of rubbing. When the lights were dim and the station quiet, she would roll it between thumb and forefinger until the ridges memorized themselves into the skin of her palm. She had nicked the coin's edge the night someone called her dead to command and laughed without cruelty. It was a joke to the institution that had written her away, an administrative footnote, an erasure stamped into a database she no longer could access. To her, the coin was a private ledger, proof she could still feel. The giant all but shattered the stretcher as EMTs wrestled him into a trauma bay. His chest heaved, ribs grinding like old hinges. He smelled of motor oil and smoke and something metallic that made the nurses step back. A man of first light muscle and old scars, his jaw set against a memory that didn't fit the room. He was a walking source of heat and danger. Sergeant Jackson Hayes screamed before he spoke. Not words, no rational plea, just a raw animal sound torn out of his throat, as if something huge and hungry had been sitting on the wrong side of his mind. He fought not with the ambulance crew, but with the memory that had crawled up underneath his skin. Shouts in a foreign night, the thump of boots over pavement, the taste of sand on his tongue. He didn't see the fluorescent lights and the beige curtains, and the nurse with the coin in her pocket. He saw a perimeter. He saw a body that shouldn't have moved. He saw a command that had been given and then betrayed. Brenda took one step forward, and then another, voice crisp. Team on Bay 3, clean and clear. Move. She moved with the kind of certainty people assumed you were born with. Small hands jittered. Someone dropped a tray. Dr. Sterling already had his gloves on, his face a practiced mask of indignation, part curiosity, part hunger, for a spectacle he could file away and lecture about in the morning. Aurora folded into the periphery and watched. She watched Jackson's hands tremble, watched the way his pupils darted too fast. Her own fingers tightened around the coin in her pocket until the metal whispered against cloth. For a second, she let the old habit run, the history of her shoulders in dangerous rooms, the way noise turned to orders and orders became muscle memory. She felt memory like a ghost limb, teeth of reflex she had to learn not to use. "He's combative," the EMT said. "Possible head trauma, high pulse, strong, controlled substances. Take him to trauma," Sterling cut in. "We stabilize, run full panel." "Ease the language, Greg," Brenda said. "Don't make it a headline." Jackson roared as if the room had broken promises. Someone flinched. A supply cart clattered. The giant's head snapped toward the sound of his own name, as if the syllables had been a whip. He tried to lunge. Security reached in with a hold that was efficient but not enough. He slipped like wet rope, pulling a defender to the floor with the momentum of a truck. Everyone stepped back, except Aurora. She moved with a kind of calm that wasn't dramatic. She moved like someone who had practiced standing still, then had been taught when to step. She walked into the ring of panicked hands and fluorescent glare with her head down and her voice in a register that carried the right weight. It wasn't loud, it wasn't performative. It simply fit into the space Jackson's memory expected to find. "Sergeant Hayes," she said. Her voice was low, the kind that could be a mother's or a lieutenant's depending on who listened. "Look at me." He spat blood, and the word turned to a foam. His eyes were unfocused for a heartbeat, and then fixed. Something recognized the pitch. His shoulders jerked and stilled. Muscle memory doesn't care who raps it, only that it is rapped. The room took its breath like a held note. Aurora continued. Her hands were calm. She didn't try to pry his fingers away in a way that would escalate. She talked like someone delivering bad news in a way that could still be survived. "You're safe. You're safe here. Breathe with me. 1, 2, 3. The numbers were small anchors. The giant's chest heaved around them until his sobs became something human. He did not collapse, but he slowed. He did not strike out again. He looked at her, suddenly small and very tired. When she stepped in to finish the hold, a crisp, efficient move that shut down the threat without breaking bone, everyone's eyes jumped. The hold wasn't a sequence so much as a conversation with pressure and leverage. A hand at a throat, an elbow at the diaphragm, an arm that folded like a hinge. They watched her half lift, half guide him onto the stretcher with a competence that felt too practiced for a nurse who folded napkins and took vitals. "Who is this woman?" Sterling said under his breath, and the question broke like a small wave across the room. There are almost invisibles in hospitals. Young nurses, students, temps, the janitor who knows where every filter is. Aurora had been one of those until tonight. Tonight, the staff's eyes traced the firm line of her jaw and lingered on the thin scar at the nape of her neck, where hair parted at a slight ridge. An almost notice. The coin in her pocket glinted like a secret, and she thumbed it until the noise was nothing but wind. Brenda cleared her throat and snapped a smile that attempted to be inclusive, but wasn't. "She's new. Aurora. Clinical one. Good with vitals, steady with anxious families. We were lucky she's here." "She didn't just steady him," a tech said. "She put him down like a pro. I've seen that before in the field." Brenda's mouth hardened. "Not your field," she said. "He's a patient. We do what we do." The cameras in the ER, part of the hospital's routine surveillance, hid in a ceiling corner like an indifferent eye. They recorded everything. Aurora's hands, the way her voice pitched, Jackson's slow collapse into terror, and then into a compliant exhaustion. Someone would review the footage. Someone would freeze frames and make notes. For now, the tape was just another hum of the night. A pager buzzed. General Tobias Hollet's name up on the board. Security flagged it high priority. Hollet wasn't in regular rotation at Mercy, General. He was the kind of man whose visits made people straighten involuntarily, whose presence made file cabinets feel inadequate. He had been a 3-star once, and that history carries like a scent. "Get him stabilized," Sterling said. His smile had the brittle shine of curiosity turning to ownership. "Check for head bleed," Brenda ordered. "CT on rapid." Aurora stayed beside the stretcher a beat longer than politeness required. The coin burned cold in her palm as if remembering its own temperature. She rubbed it, soft and automatic. "Still here," she said to the metal, a whisper no one heard. It was a private phrase that tasted of iron and oath. Later, when the room emptied and the rain kept tapping like fingers against the glass, she would remember the taste and know it by the sound. "If this is holding you, stay with it. There was still a long night ahead. The first official arrival came in a suit instead of a uniform, a man who moved like he had places to be and didn't like the feeling of open doors. General Hollet's face had the same weathered map that older men in high places wear, diplomacy and warning etched in the lines. He looked at the footage on a tablet someone pressed forward, with the kind of casual force that told you authority expected explanations. Freeze frame, Aurora's profile, the scar, the way her hands worked. Hollet's eyes narrowed. The nurse who pressed her lips together in the background looked at Hollet's face and then looked away quickly. He did not ask who the nurse was. He would not need to. Outside the sliding doors, a black van idled under the sodium glow. It had no logos, no markings, just its own shadow. Men in plain dark coats clustered near its rear. One of them lit a cigarette with a hand big enough to break the cigarette in half. Someone's phone flashed mapping software in blue light. This was the sort of thing that would be filed away, categorized as unknown contractors, and then shrugged into the margins until someone in a conference room remembered a name. A phone in Aurora's locker vibrated. She didn't answer it at first. Nerves, training, the reflex to leave the personal in the locker room. When she finally pulled it out, a number she didn't recognize flashed, and a voice spoke through tin and static. "Get Jackson out. Hollet's not clean. They want control, not care. Run him to the cellar. Do not go through main exits." The voice was clipped, genderless, with the gravel of someone who'd spent too long under fluorescent lights and worse. Aurora's fingers tightened. The hair on the back of her neck prickled the way bad weather does. The call ended with an exchange of coordinates clipped in code and a closing line. The speaker didn't expect anyone to understand if they listened. "Dead to command," someone had said once, in a room with too many files and not enough humanity. A paper verdict. But the phrase is only a signature if you let it be. The static in the line dissolved, and something blank sat where instruction might have been. Aurora folded into herself, and the coin in her pocket felt like an ember. "Hollet's here?" Brenda asked, not quite sure whose permission she was seeking. "He's on the floor," someone said. "He wants to see the footage." Hollet watched the tape, not for the spectacle but for recognition. He watched the nurse who entered the bay and the sergeant who fell quiet, the silent exchange of a command voice and a memory. Hollet's jaw worked once, then twice. He looked at the tablet like it had lied to him all night. Across the room, Dr. Sterling's curiosity had teeth. "She has technique," he said, stepping closer than etiquette ordinarily allowed. "Where did she learn that?" "She learned to save people," Aurora said softly, voice flat as a surgical drape. It was a small deflection, and it kept the man from digging. Sterling's eyes latched instead on the wound on Jackson's temple, on the way his knuckles were gouged raw. He wanted a textbook, a neat chain of events. Real life doesn't offer those with any gratitude. Outside, the men by the van moved with synchronized steps. They were mercenaries in the sense that they had a day job that intersected a violent night. Their leader, Kane, watched Hollet's approaching shadow and smiled the barest line because some men trade in unrest. Kane's reputation was a rumor made solid by choices. He had the sort of face that could be once sold as charming and then later read as dangerous. The lines around his eyes stored lies like old receipts. He checked his watch. There was nothing like a waiting room to sharpen an appetite. Mercy General's security team tried to exert control with a firmness that came cheap on paper. The men outside were polite in a way that would have been more alarming if their politeness didn't have the friction of intent. They signed no papers in the ER. They flashed no badges. They made requests instead, small strategic questions that could be interpreted as reasonable. Access to the patient, a police escort, integration, not invasion, until it wasn't. Hollet stepped into the room, a man whose presence rearranged the posture of others. He didn't smile. He recognized the nurse's scar, as if he'd seen similar before, and that recognition flickered like a gone light. He looked at Aurora, and his face pivoted between an assessment of risk and an old memory. He spoke in the voice of seniority, smooth as polished cedar. "Sergeant Hayes is under my purview," he said. "Secure the patient. No unauthorized releases." Under his skin, there was a decision making itself: protect, control, or cover. Jolé's gaze drifted to the surveillance feed on the wall and lingered where Aurora's face was frozen in motion. The tape never lies, but those who are quiet around it know how to edit perception. They pushed Jackson into a private room to remove him from public sight, and that's when the night shifted from crisis to trap. People rearranged themselves around authority as a matter of survival. Dr. Sterling asked for a full workup. Jolé asked for discretion. The mercenaries asked for safe transport. Beneath the sterile lamplight, their demands braided into something Ursula K. Le Guin would have called the choice of the few. Aurora felt the pull like an undertow. She was a nurse who had been taught to bind wounds, but something more ancient than training perched at the base of her skull, the knowledge of being a tool and an instrument removed from the people who had once made that tool. She felt the coin cold in her pocket, an accusation and a comfort both. Jackson's breathing hitched. He muttered fragments of a place Aurora's mind refused to give him in full unless he allowed it. Colors, acronyms, the echo of an order that was supposed to be absolute. His eyes sometimes slid into a calculation zone, eye-tracking where there was none, scanning for threats that belonged to a map Aurora knew in the creases of her hands. She had seen that calculation in others a long time ago, years locked into nights when orders were life. The look doesn't always belong to those who have authority. It belongs to those who have been given a responsibility and forced to shoulder it alone. A nurse from telemetry bolted the door with the sort of small, unnecessary measure people take when they sense a storm coming. They moved Jackson to a bed in the sub-level for observation. Out of sight, they said. Protected, they promised. The elevator groaned as it took them down. The ER unwound into corridors of storage and boiler rooms, places of humming infrastructure and old pipes. The hospital's basement smelled of hot metal and detergent. It felt like a place where secrets were kept because no one wanted to talk about them. The van's shadow at ground level thinned into night. The call came through Aurora's pocket again, a different number, different voice. "Jolé's not your ally," the caller said bluntly. "They're bringing contractors. Do not trust Jolé's men. You have to move the sergeant before they do." "Who is this?" Aurora asked, because she had to ask something. "Someone who knows names," the voice answered. "You were marked as dead to command. That doesn't mean the command forgot you. It means you were dropped from the roster. They still remember your voice." The phrase, "dead to command," was a paper razor. It had been used in rooms too small for conscience. Some decisions don't die quietly in files. They float like trapped papers in hospital vents. The voice on the line gave Aurora coordinates to a maintenance door, an off-the-books exit that smelled of oil and hope. It said the word cellar, like an offering. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, trying to hold her voice neutral and not betraying the churn under her ribs. "Because you know how to move when the floor drops," the voice said. "Get the sergeant out, burn the trail, and don't stay to make a hero of yourself." A hero. The word sat between her teeth and tasted like rust. They moved Jackson through narrow corridors that belonged to the hospital's skeleton. The boilers roared like beasts, steam hissing into the air in a way that dressed the scene in a fairy tale of fog. Pipes sang, bulbs flickered. The world under the hospital was the underside of necessity, where water met fire and old machines kept breathing because there was no one to turn them off. And then the men from the van did not ask. They entered with the air of entitlement, practiced by people who buy their own answers. Kane led them in like all predators do, small inquiry disguised as assumed permission. He nodded to Holay as if Holay had written him a letter of reference. Holay nodded back with the stiff politeness of a man whose ledger has far more shadows than light. Kane's team moved with precise chaos. They were polite with threats and quiet with force. They asked for the patient formally and then smiled like that smile had been tailored for a courtroom. Holay's voice took on the kind of official cadence that cleans morality. "Transfer to secure custody," he said. "Standard protocols." Jackson's breaths shortened. His eyes slid into a place where memory built a barricade, and blood had the taste of old orders. He tried to ask who the men were, and his words snagged on lungs and fear. The men in dark coats moved to close the distance, too quickly, too clean. There are moments when the world gives you a pretense and waits to see what you'll do with it. Aurora looked at Jackson on the stretcher. She looked at Holay in a suit. Then she looked at the men from the van. She felt the coin in her pocket as if it were a small, live thing. Her training told her to keep the patient, to follow orders, to let authority fold everything into a paper tag and take it away. But being dead to command had taught her something else. How the dead can call back with the right phrase, how erasure doesn't always bury everything it touches. She knew what to trust. She knew trust sometimes meant breaking the rules. She moved with intent. The first small crossing that should have been innocuous, asking for the sergeant's blanket, skated like a pebble across water. Kane's men obliged with a stare that tasted violent. A hand-to-hand exchange meant more than rudeness. It was a claim attempt. Holay's eyes flicked to someone on his team, the nod like a dot of ink sealing a deal. The air compressed. Jackson snapped, a short thing, like a fuse that had finally burned down. He pushed at a strap and the room blurred. He saw the face of an old enemy for a moment. That enemy's name was sometimes bureaucracy, sometimes betrayal. And he lunged. The mercenaries reacted. Holay's men moved to control with the efficiency of people trained to be obedient instruments. The labored intimacy of a hospital became a battlefield, and every corner was now a place where a decision could slice the evening open. Aurora's hand went to Jackson's knee, then to his shoulder. The coin in her pocket clicked. There are ways to catch a falling man that don't look heroic. There are ways to stop a fight before it grows. Aurora didn't think about headlines. She put herself between Jackson and the men from the van. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. Her voice reached across the chaos like a line thrown into stormy water. "Sergeant Hayes," she said, "you're with me." She didn't use a hand that would look overbearing. She used pressure and proximity and a voice that sounded like the echo of a command, not the performance of one. She was not asking. She was placing an order in a register men like Jackson still listened to. Something in Jackson recognized the pitch. His shoulders lowered a fraction. He turned his head toward her as if a lighthouse had finally cut through fog. The mercenaries bristled. Kane's jaw tightened. "Who is she?" Kane asked Holay with the false politeness of a man who had everything but patience. Holay's answer was a slow exhale. "Hospital staff. Move the subject, now." Holay's hesitance took the shape of calculation. He had options that smelled like immunity. He had contractors who would obey, and a hospital staff with liabilities he could cover. The room became a ledger, and people are mere accounting entries when you're used to balancing books with lives against them. Aurora slid a hand into her pocket and felt the coin. It was a touchstone, nothing more, perhaps nothing less. Someone else might have called it superstition. For her it was a key to a compact with herself. Stay or vanish. Keep the sergeant or hand him over. For a moment everything reframed. The faces, the priorities, the line that separates care from custody. Holay's hand moved as if he would sign the page. Kane's men reached like collectors. Jackson's breathing faltered. Then, without notice, the power in the nearest corridor flickered. A sharp whistle of steam cut the air as an overhead valve popped open in the maintenance shafts. An old hospital's complaint, fog rolling through the corridor like a theater effect. The world blurred white for a breath, and in that heartbeat the mercenaries lost their sightlines. It was not a grand plan, it was accident and choice tangled together. Someone's boot hit a pipe, someone's elbow brushed a thermostat. The fog swirled heavy, and the men in dark coats stumbled like actors who had lost their marks. Visibility dropped to a shallow meter, the clench moment that would have become a gunshot, and then headlines dissolved into the hiss of steam and the scrape of shoes. Aurora moved through the fog like she knew where the gaps were. Her hand on Jackson's bare wrist found pulse and purpose. She guided him like someone leading a drowned man up out of his own memories. The air smelled of hot iron and old wiring, electricity where the heartbeat must keep up. They ducked into a service corridor that smelled of oil and must and the unspoken things you keep under buildings. The mercenaries cursed. Kane's whispered orders hit the steam like pebbles. Hole's voice broke through with clipped commands that tried to reassert the world he favored: control, containment, custody. But when sight returns, it comes with a delay, and that delay gave Aurora the window she needed. She found the maintenance door the caller had pointed out, a small metal hatch that someone had painted the color of forgotten things. Her thumb, numb with adrenaline, found the coin and turned it in her pocket. She pressed it into the metal edge absent-mindedly and felt the texture of the coin match the cold smooth of the handle. A ridiculous instinct told her she should not hesitate. She didn't. "Down here," she hissed, short, precise. Her voice was barely audible over the vent. Jackson's face was pale in the steam. He looked at her with a complexity that made guilt curl under his ribs. Aurora looked back at him in the same way, fierce, patient, small but immovable. They slid through the door and into a shaft of light that smelled like cleaned metal and ancient paper. The descent felt like going back through the years. The hospital folded over them. Above, the mercenaries would be coming through the fog, like wolves led by scent. The basement corridor swallowed them. The hatch banged shut behind them. The sound was almost an apology, and only faintly a triumph. The corridor hummed with the hospital's blood, pipes, fans, the muted thump of equipment in other rooms. It felt like being inside a creature. Aurora guided Jackson by a shoulder, bandaging a wound as she went with the nervous hands of someone used to the mechanics of saving a life. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone could put a new memory into his face and change the night entirely. When they reached an intersection, the floor felt slick beneath their feet. Water beaded on the tile. Distant footsteps echoed as a film of panic thinned on the other side of the hatch. "You're with me," Aurora repeated, softer this time. He laughed then, an uneven, brittle sound, because laughter is often what comes when fear is too heavy to carry. "Why are you doing this?" he rasped. "You don't even know me." "You're not the first one to need help," she said, and it was true, but it was also something else entirely. She led them past old storage areas, past boxes of paper whose labels had long since become rumors, past a sign for electrical authorized personnel only that didn't intimidate her, because she had been authorized once in a way that mattered more than paper. The voice on her phone vibrated again. This time, the call was a short, crisp message left in the kind of voice meant to be replayed. "Hole's not coming clean. They want Hayes in custody. The van's team is not for care. You have one exit and it isn't the main lot. Look for the coin." Aurora's palm burned. She drew the coin out and turned it in the meager light. She had rubbed it like this 1,000 times without consequence. The raised design, an emblemless pattern that could have been jewelry or a currency, caught the fluorescent light and sent back a tiny signal. In that turn, she remembered the phrase she had told herself in the hallway, the tiny whisper against the metal, "Still here." She didn't say it aloud, not yet. There is a difference between a whisper meant to steady a hand and a word meant to unlock a life. Above them, footsteps creaked and the world turned like a page. The steam had dispersed, and the corridor beyond the hatch was a sketch in red and grey. Voices raised, a shout, the sound of an authority being reasserted. "He belongs to us," someone said. "We have orders." "Orders can be filled and still be wrong," Aurora wanted to say, but the corridor swallowed the phrase. She kept moving. Kane's men fanned out like professionals, calling the space with clipped directions. Holé's presence outside the hatch was a constant pressure, and they had run out of luck to claim. Inside, the hospital basement smelled of something else, metal and the damp patience of old machinery. The walls were lined with pipes and conduits like a city's arteries. Somewhere deeper there was a door that the caller on Aurora's phone had described in a map of half-words and urgency. A door that no one who worked the day shift remembered because it hadn't been on the map for years. They reached a set of double doors marked Service. They were heavy and not what the caller had suggested. Aurora stopped and felt the coin against her palm one last time. She slid her fingers into her pocket and found a metal tab sewn into the seam of the scrub jacket, an old tag, no longer active, the colour of time. She used it like a bookmark, and it felt like a proof she had been something other than small in another life. Behind those double doors, the hospital took on a different sound. The pipes were louder, the air taste of ozone, the light more clinical and less human. It smelled like places where people sweat and decide things that strangers read about in years to come. It felt like a corridor that had its own memory. They moved through a narrow service tunnel that led into stacked rooms of equipment. The sound of the van faded like a bad dream. The world above them was still arguing. Jackson's chest rose and fell. His eyes were closed now, not from calm, but from an exhaustion that had no name. He was a man who had been given orders and then betrayed by them. Aurora's hands were steady on the bandage. The coin lay warm in her palm, and as she walked, she hummed the phrase under her breath in a way that had nothing to do with air and everything to do with promise. Still here. A light blinked at the far end of a service alcove. It was not unlike the little emergency lights that blink in any building, so small and so persistent. She thought of the voice that had given coordinates. She thought of Holé and Kane, and a practice that made men replace people with problems. At the corridor's end, a door waited, a squat metal door with no label. It was a dented thing that looked like someone had bent reality a little just to make room for it. It had no obvious lock, only a small grille, and a panel that looked like it had been painted over too many times. Aurora didn't open it. She placed the coin against the metal surface, not thinking technically, but thinking in gestures. She had always been one to trust private rituals in moments of public violence. You do a thing because it anchors you. Her thumb found the coin's worn edge, and she breathed once, feeling the rhythm of Jackson beside her. She smiled, though it was a thin thing edged in fatigue. The coin flashed in a patch of light as if responding. "Stay with me," she told him, and the words were both a promise and a command. He squeezed her hand with a strength she didn't expect, and a sorrow that made her chest hurt. "How do you keep doing this?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She was more interested in the door than in the reasons men break and mend. Her fingers flexed the coin. She could say the phrase that would have meant nothing to any ordinary person, a whispered thing tied to her past orders. It was a small, private set of syllables meant for a phone line in a world that had given her up. It was a voice code used to unlock the access of a life she had been told she didn't have any more. The steam in the walls thinned to a whimper, and footsteps above them slowed. Down here the world kept its breath. Aurora's lips moved in the faintest sound. She felt the word before she formed it. Still here. It passed like a memory from her mouth and caught on the metal. For a moment nothing happened but the hum of the building and the feel of the coin warm in her palm. Then somewhere inside the door, something that had been waiting since she was written off as nothing clicked like an old hinge remembering itself. They had thought they had killed her past with paperwork and erasure. They did not reckon with what a voice can still claim. A faint machinery note answered, the kind of sound you only notice if you have been the sort of person who listens for doors that used to open on command. It was not mechanical detail the way a manual would describe it. It was a recognition, a small concession from a constructed architecture to a human sound. The metal thumped, a low, promising answer. Above them a shout sliced the night. The hatch they'd come through rattled. Men moved. Someone cursed. Aurora felt the mechanism answer like a held breath letting go. The door sighed inward on a hinge that had not been touched in years. A sliver of light licked the edge of the frame. Behind it, things that belonged to another rule of life sat in patient rows. Aurora's eyes adjusted faster than she expected, the way someone whose nights were full of small details learns to read in the dark. Racks of cases, a trolley of old medical packs labelled in hand-scrawled ink, a faded placard with an emblem she half remembered, signs of an architecture built to serve and to disappear. It was not a showy sanctuary. It was a utility room that knew how to be invisible. A narrow operations chamber tucked into the hospital's bones, bolted into an old maintenance alcove and fed into the smell of metal and oil. A folding table held a battered radio, a half-charged power supply, and a stack of paper envelopes somebody had once considered worth the trouble of secrecy. A padded chair waited like an apology. Everything was practical and faded, like belongings left by a unit that had been moved on in a hurry. Aurora stepped through, as if stepping into a memory. The coin in her palm felt warm. She set it on the table like an offering, and watched the way the stereo light above the door blinked in a steady, careful rhythm. She had expected evidence of erasure, files hidden in analog places because digital ones had been scrubbed, but the room offered something human. A name scrawled on a sticky note, a call sign on a yellowing index card. Ghost. She found a folder stamped with a hospital code and a year. Inside, an archival printout held phrases she'd only ever heard in closed rooms. Operational designations, a thin list of personnel. Lines of text had been struck through in thick black ink, as if someone had tried to excise the past with a blunt instrument. Aurora's name had been one of them. The strike-through made the letters look like scars. But someone careful and conscientious, had left an additional packet beneath the folder, an old ID badge, faded to the color of varnished wood. It bore a photo with a younger Aurora in a duty uniform she almost did not recognize as herself. On the back, a single line of handwriting, voice confirmed, command access revoked, dead to command, archive retention. She inhaled, a small private sound. The evidence did not redeem everything. It simply proved what the coin and the scar had only whispered. Her past was real, and it had been buried for reasons that smelled of bureaucracy and fear. But the room also offered practical things, contraband for a crisis, a duffel with a few sealed rations, an emergency med kit with sterile wraps and a tourniquet, a hand-cranked battery pack, and a rolled emergency blanket that felt familiar in a way the hospital linens did not. There was also a reinforced phone set, old, deliberately analog, its keypad worn in places as if someone had punched the same numbers in a lifetime. She touched the radio. The hiss of an old channel answered, an artifact of another era's security. On the wall, a map of Mercy General marked in coloured pins the routes for supply deliveries, maintenance access points, and an exit that led under the loading dock. It was exactly what the caller had promised, a way out that bypassed the public face of the hospital. Behind Aurora, Jackson made a small sound of disbelief. The fog of his memory had not entirely lifted. What remained was raw. "How?" he began, but the breath broke on him. "Not how," Aurora said. Her voice was low, not theatrical. "Where? We go that way. Quiet. You can lean on me." He did, gratefully heavy and fragile at once. She wrapped a bandage tighter with hands that had forgotten the weight of a promise and remembered how to keep a life from unmaking itself. He watched her work with an expression that mixed astonishment and a child's relief, the way someone clinging to the edge of sleep hears a voice that confirms the world is still there. They had little time. Above them, the sounds of pursuit had gotten louder, the mercenaries moving like a second storm. Hollet's voice threaded through in clipped sentences, his authority attempting to reassert order in a place where order had already been judged. There were shouts, the reverberation of boots, the metallic ring of a key turned by someone who expected doors to open because men of power had asked them to. The hospital's mechanical groan swallowed much of their movement, but not the urgency. "Stay low," Aurora said. It was a lie. There was no cover here that could make them invisible, but it kept Jackson's head from turning too often. Her eyes mapped the map again and found the narrow service tunnel the caller had referenced, a maintenance conduit that angled down, then ran under the facility and surfaced just beyond the loading dock's ramp. The route was cramped, smelling of grease and old damp cardboard, but it opened onto a narrow cobbled alley behind Mercy General where a van could be waiting, or not. The thing about plans is they are faith dressed in a sketch. They survived on boldness and the sliver of luck that followed hard on the heels of the desperate. Aurora found a small keypad recessed in the wall beside the door they'd entered through, an older model, its digits worn smooth like the coin. There was an emblem etched faintly in the corner, a seal that matched the note in the folder. For a second, Aurora stood in front of it, the coin still in her hand, feeling the weight of reputations that had declared her nothing. She didn't need the panel to obey her. She needed to be recognized by the thing it had been programmed to accept, a human voice that had once been a command string, a phrase that functioned as signal and signature. She leaned forward and spoke the code as if reciting a name someone she loved kept on the tip of their tongue. It was not technical. Nobody listening would have made sense of it. It was private, a short set of syllables stitched to memory and oath. "Still here," she said. The mechanism in the wall responded, not because it understood meaning, but because it had been tuned to recognize that sound as authority. A bolt retracted, a small hatch popped open, revealing a secondary supply compartment with a rolled cable, a flashlight, and a thin cloth-wrapped object that looked absurdly like a child's blanket. It was a minor human detail, someone's attempt to make survival feel less sterile. "You used that phrase," Jackson murmured. It was accusation and comfort in the same breath. "You said it in the hallway." "Because it works," Aurora said. "Because it's mine." They moved. Through the maintenance tunnel, the air breathed different, colder, less human. Aurora's hand brushed the wall as if checking for the story of the building, for its seams. Every surface had history. The pipes whispered it back. She had used rooms like these before, years ago, when her voice had meant everything, and erasure had not been a verdict but a reprieve. Back then, she had been an asset. Now she was a nurse with a dead file and a mouth that could still call a door open. The corridor roared into a fan of light and then spat them out onto a pale concrete service bay, half hidden from the loading dock. For a beat, the world was an alley of sodium light and the distant sound of traffic. A battered cargo door yawned near them, and beyond it the ramp offered a route down to the dock's shadowed edge. But the dock was not empty. 2 of Kane's men had already arrived, because he had had enough partners in timing to make the world a small place. One had a rifle slung low across his chest. The other scanned the alley, like someone auditioning for vigilance. They saw Aurora and Jackson and moved. Their boots were soft but purposeful. Kane's men had the kind of trained menace that uses intimidation more than direct force until it must. "Stop!" the nearest man barked. He was not the leader. He did not wear the same arrogance as Kane, but he was the muscle who would make the first claim. Aurora stepped forward without drama, "We're leaving," she said, and her voice was the same instrument that had quieted Jackson in the ER. It held the echo of orders no longer recognized by the world, but still potent in the way it carried. She did not reach for a weapon. Instead, she put herself between Jackson and the man with the rifle, a small, solid paper wall of presence. Something in Kane's man misread the gap between confidence and threat. He raised his rifle in a clean, rehearsed motion. That should have been the clear end of things, metal arriving and the body following the law of force. But hands are slow through adrenaline. Triggers are quicker only when practiced with the expectation of death. The first shot cracked the night and ricocheted off the loading bay's metal with a sound like a warning. Olay's voice cut across the open space, sharper than radio static, a command that tried to turn the narrative he had started into something righteous. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" The words were meant to bind, but the world had learned not to listen to the sound of men who had sold their loyalty. Kane heard it as the last act of a man who had decided he needed to salvage something by force. Olay moved as well, a false calm in his step, the kind of man who believed the law began and ended with his willingness to declare it. Kane laughed in a way that tasted like iron. He stepped out from the shadow with his hands empty, his face a mask that had been rehearsed for moments like this. "You always did love the scenery, General," he said. The words were meant to needle, to show Olay his place in a ledger. There was a breathless exchange of stares. Kane's team shifted, corners of their mouths tight. Olay straightened, as if he had the authority to squash the moment. And then Kane's smile cracked. A hand in a pocket, a decision made to cut a loose thread. Kane moved like someone choosing to close a file permanently. The gunshot that followed was not calculated to bring justice. It sounded like an answer to an old debt. Olay staggered, as if the sound had finally found a place where policy could not keep him upright. The general's hand flew to his chest. Blood darkened his shirt in a spreading, quick note. He looked at Kane like a man remade into an accusation. And then he dropped to his knees in a slow, deflated negotiation with gravity. Shock is a flat sound in a noisy world. People shout and then devolve into the useless comedy of flailing hands. Kane's men reacted with the lethal efficiency of people who had traded compassion for pay. A shot came toward Jackson as he lunged, not aiming to kill so much as to disable the threat that had suddenly become brave in spite of itself. But the world had a way of feeding courage into the hands of the desperate. Jackson's body, even wounded and ragged, had a memory of charging. He saw Olay underhand, like a man who'd been ordered to believe the world would respond to forms, and he saw a moral line gored by Kane's bullet. He moved like thunder. He hit Kane's nearest flank with a force that translated all his internal violence into a single devastating charge. The mercenary reeled under the surprise and the weight, and for a heartbeat it looked like the old man in the suit might be taken away from the field by a ragged soldier. Olay's blood painted the dock. Kane's men scrambled to cover, but chaos is contagious and not always lethal by design. Shots rang, a scrape of metal, the cry of someone struck. Security poured onto the dock, some hospital guards, then uniformed officers called by the first civilian witnesses. Captain Miller, steady and square-shouldered, appeared at the far end with a radio clenched in his hand, his face the unremarkable shield of someone whose job was to knot the ends of night into a rope. Aurora moved through the chaos like someone with a map printed under her skin. She ducked low, dragged Jackson from a line of fire, and pressed a hand to the wound in Olay's side. She did not look for gratitude. She only wanted the immediate arithmetic of life and death. Olay's eyes found her for a moment, shocked, then warily aware of the hand that refused to treat him as the ledger he believed himself to be. In that brief lock of vision was a history of decisions that had cost lives. Kane, pinned under Jackson's weight, fought with the reflexive brutality of a man who'd never believed he'd be stopped. He reached for a pistol. Jackson's eyes met his, and in the white heat of that exchange there was no malice left, only an exhausted, furious defense. He struck Kane's arm where it moved, the pistol discharged harmlessly into the concrete. Kane's face contorted, the lie of his fear cracking across his jaw. Security closed in with cuffs and the clatter of steel. Police read the script of arrest into the frayed language of the night. Captain Miller barked orders that made real things happen: hold positions, secure the scene, clear civilians. In the swirl, Holay's breathing grew shallow. He looked at Aurora as the paramedics arrived, his face a bruise of surprise and a concession of something worse than shame. A medic worked the wound with grim efficiency and without sentiment. The law and the bayonet of medical practice does not always conspire to the same God. Holay's last words to no one, or perhaps to himself, were barked like a man trying to buy time with authority. "Secure the records. Take them to me." Then his voice failed, and he was a man, suddenly, in need. Kane's men were detained. Cameras were already fed with the night's insane choreography. Witnesses would speak. Spreadsheets would be made. But some things did not end in paperwork. The truth that had been whispered over the radio in Aurora's pocket, that Holay had compromised the mission, had been made ugly and final by a bullet that was meant to silence accountability. The mercenaries had not been there to save life. They had been there to collect assets. The night had been laid bare. In the shift that followed, people moved toward the practical. Captain Miller's radio barked into the dark. "We need an ambulance. Now! Secure the scene! Whoever that woman is, we need her statement." His eyes found Aurora at last, steady and small and wearing a bandage she had placed on a general who had merit and sin in equal measure. He took in the way she had steadied Jackson, the way she had been a pivot around which the night spun, and he made an assessment that moved clinical registered skepticism into something like respect. "You're safe," he told her. The line had the authority of a man who knew the difference between a threat and a rescue. "I need to get him out," Aurora said. "We can't hand him over." Miller's face tightened. He had seen the shape of cases like this before, where legal ownership and moral right diverged. He listened to Holay's medic report, to the muttering of the mercenaries as they were read their rights, to the cordoned-off van that now looked more like evidence than a conveyance. The hospital lights hummed. Rain had reduced to a taunt. "There's no guarantee," Miller said, "but if you've got a place to put him that keeps him safe until proper authorities can come in with a warrant." Aurora did not wait for the full weight of law to consider mercy. She nudged the paramedic aside and asserted control the only way she knew how, with decisive, humble authority. She spoke in the voice that had once opened doors and altered registers, small, precise, mortal. "This way," she said. "Loader Bay, exit 3. Underground. We go now." He hesitated. The world habits of order made men slow. Then Captain Miller, practical to the bone, made the choice people admire, the one that keeps life over bureaucracy. He nodded, and in that nod he joined the fragile, dangerous alliance of people who choose to protect the unprotected when institutions falter. They moved fast and loud as the dock tried to recompose itself into a courtroom. Media vans were a rumor on the perimeter. The hospital attempted an air of professional neutrality. Aurora led, Jackson leaning on her like a man learning to walk on the far side of ruin. The hidden passage they had used before played the role of convenient savior. They slid into it in a blur of rain-wet clothing and the smell of hot metal. They were not unobserved. A detective with a camera on his jacket muttered into a recorder that a civilian had witnessed a van with plates altered, an observation that felt like small justice. But the night had settled its priorities. Holay's fall would be filed and debated. Kane's arrest would be processed. For now, the immediate arithmetic of survival was their truth, and Aurora calculated it with the same economy as she had calculated compressions and breaths in rooms with more oxygen than sense. At the end of the tunnel, a rusted maintenance hatch led out to a narrow service road. A delivery van sat idling in the shadow as if waiting for legitimate business. Its back doors were a pale promise. There was an identity card clipped to the driver's hat. Another layer of theatre in a world of assumed permissions. Captain Miller ordered the van secured by 2 uniformed officers who would swear on their lives to a partial truth and leave the rest as an ellipsis. A medic checked Jackson's vitals again. Aurora's hands shook as she wrapped them around the warmth of his palm. "You can leave," she told him quietly as they climbed in the back, the van's interior smelling of diesel and cold-weather insulation. "Go to Walter Reed. Get yourself seen. Get someone to hold you while you sleep." He looked at her as if learning something about the world might be theft. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Aurora said. There was no drama in it. She had been measured out of too many rooms and had decided that the currency she would spend now was not explanation, but action. Go, and, if you get out, look for a coin. You'll know it. He clutched her hand, closed his eyes, as if to memorize a face. "What's your name?" he asked. Simple, human, with a soldier's hunger for anchors. She smiled in a tired, private way. "You know it," she said. "You used to obey it. It's not for the world, it's for you." The van left like a secret. Aurora watched it go until its taillights dissolved into rain. Captain Miller's steady presence stayed long enough to arrange statements, to produce a perfunctory ID check, and to nod once, an absent-minded hush of recognition that said, in the unspectacular way of offices that must preserve themselves, "We will cover this because it keeps people alive." Then he left them with a look that promised discretion, in the way only local men who understood the bureaucracy do, a practical kindness. "Go before the press gets here," he said. "If you need help, call me." Aurora slipped back into the hospital when the van had become just another smear in the night's ledger. She moved through spaces that had looked at her earlier and decided what to do with them now. The operations chamber behind the maintenance door was a place of archives and a few dwindling comforts. It had given them the route they needed. Inside, she found a small waterproof pouch tucked under the table and a single typed sheet. A list of names with one circled in ink. Ghost. Below it, in sloppier handwriting, a line, "If seen, protect. If alive, signal, still here." It was not vindication. It was a piece of someone else's conscience folded into paper. Aurora folded it again and slipped it back where she had found it. There were other things, too. A worn radio with batteries still attached, a small black binder that contained names of contractors and operational notes crossed out by someone who had chosen to hide rather than to accept being complicit. The binder contained no solutions, only proof that what had been hidden could be shown. She left no trace but a dust smudge on the table and the ducked posture of someone who knew the architecture of escape. The hospital would reconstruct the night's narrative in weeks of interviews and memos. The tapes would be reviewed, commentators would come and go with the short attention span of outrage. The mercenaries would be held and bailed in cycles of money and law. Ole's descent would be written about as a cautionary tale. But Aurora knew the truth of the small things, the way a voice could still open a door, the way a coin could still warm your palm, and the way being dead to command did not mean you ceased to be a person who could answer calls. In the days that followed, things moved in their predictable way. Jackson was transported to a military hospital where competent hands put his bones and nerves back into an order the world recognized. Captain Miller made an official report that hedged liability and extended commendation where it counted. Dr. Sterling wrote notes that would later be quoted by pundits who liked clean narratives. Brenda fussed over the ER staff and made sure new policies were set in place so something like that would never happen again. Mercy General's PR team wrote an aristocratic letter about dedication and safety. The cameras fuzzed with reruns. Aurora returned to the small, honest work of taking vitals and pushing trays. She folded sheets with the patience of someone who had known chaos and decided the hum of small tasks was a prayer. People asked questions, patients, colleagues, visiting officers, but she deflected them with the economy she had learned in other rooms. "We did what we had to," she would say. "We kept someone alive." The coin remained in her pocket as if it had chosen to lodge itself into her life. Sometimes she would rub it between finger and thumb on breaks and feel the memory of a night that had been carved into her like a seam. Sometimes she would stand by the supply room door and watch trainees as they developed their small professional rhythms. She found herself looking for the sound of voices on the radio in a way old soldiers do, attentive, always calculating. On a rain-dark morning months later, when winter had scattered itself thin over the city, a package arrived at Walter Reed for Sergeant Jackson Hayes. He was not expected visits where the world would reach him with a normal face, but he received a small parcel taped in the way that told someone had wrapped it hurriedly by hand. Inside, under a layer of tissue, was the coin he had seen only in a flash that night, and a short note in a blocky, paired handwriting. The coin felt the same in his palm as it had on Aurora's. Dull silver, edges rubbed raw by time and habit. The note was a single line, 3 words, as private as a breath. It read, "Keep fighting. Ghost." He looked at the coin, then at the handwriting, then at the hospital ceiling, and a strange smile, half grief, half gratitude, broke across his face. There was a sense of closure that was not closure. There was a recognition that someone had stepped between him and the kind of fate that leaves names on papers not in memory. He turned the coin over, thumb smoothing the worn edge. He thought of the nurse who had used a quiet, commanding voice to call him back from the ruins of his mind. He thought of the small, stubborn thing she had been, a woman with a scar at the nape of her neck, a coin in her pocket, and hands that could bind a wound and fold a man back into the world. He replayed faces in his head. Brenda's practiced scowl softened into concern. Hollet's final gasp of authority made mortal by a bullet, Kane's arrest as theater and consequence. And then he slammed his fist into a pillow because laughing and crying were both too big. The note was wordless eloquence. He kept the coin in his sock for the first few nights, as if proximity could translate luck. Months after that, in a city that had already rehearsed the story into headlines, Aurora was not at the center of any narrative. She still arrived for the night shift, still moved through Mercy General's corridors with the same quiet. She answered the younger nurses' questions with the same measured deflection. Her hands, once instruments of a different life, now arranged gauze and changed IVs. She smoked no glorious cigars. She made no speeches. She kept a watchful distance and a warm intolerance for small cruelties. Occasionally, someone would look at the scar on the back of her neck and wonder. Occasionally, someone would glance at the flicker of recognition in Hollet's file and decide not to speak. The institutional world has ways of returning the uncomfortable to silence. Records are amended, files are corrected, every erasure makes a new seam. But in the quiet corners of the hospital, people learn to call her Ghost sometimes, the way a scent recalls dessert. It was a name whispered like an amen. The phrase, "dead to command," became a private joke between 2 nurses who had shared a late-night coffee and a memory. They would say it with a laugh that carried the residue of nights they had survived, and the coin would tinkle like a small bell in Aurora's pocket. She was not a hero on posters. She was an unpaid, lukewarm ember of something more profound, a person who had chosen to keep others alive at the cost of remaining invisible herself. That choice carried an expense. It meant she could not stay when scrutiny sharpened into a hunt. It meant that when the world decided to align proper law with visibility, she absented herself from the applause. One night, months after the gunfire and the hospital's reorganization, Aurora walked out of Mercy General into a rain that felt like an old conversation. She had left a short note in the operations chamber under the faded binder. If needed, use the exits. If safe, keep this small. No names, only directions. For her, anonymity was not a cowardice, but a kind of mercy. She had learned to erase herself to save others more times than she could count. In the alley behind the loading dock, she slipped the coin from her pocket and rolled it between thumb and forefinger, the way she always had. Someone once called her dead to command and had meant to make it an insult. She had turned the phrase into a promise. She mouthed the words like a benediction, still here. They felt like an answer and a vow. Then she vanished into the city's beat like an afterimage. She took a train with no intention of registering her presence. She took a bus that did not demand loyalty. She took nights in cheap rooms and days in public libraries. She moved in the way people who wish to be unremarkable move. Small purchases, no contracts, names that dissolve into the common flow. Some nights she walked past a recruitment office and smiled at the young men and women who still believed that the world would honor their service. She kept silent. She had learned that silence sometimes keeps people alive. In the rare hours when sleep left her awake and the coin chimed against her palm, Aurora would replay the faces she'd met in the ER. Jackson, who had been a world of broken orders and stubborn courage. Holay, who had been both protector and perpetrator. Kane, who had traded money for the right to choose who lived. She did not romanticize her actions. They had been brutal when they needed to be, and tender when they could be. She had made a choice that kept life intact, however messy that life might be, and then she had withdrawn because the institution that had birthed her also wanted to count her as an incident or a paper on a desk. The moral of her story sprawled over a lot of quiet moments. Loyalty is complicated. Survival sometimes has no legal rubric. The people who do the physical work of mercy are rarely the ones who occupy headlines. She had been declared dead to command. In truth, she had only been made invisible by a ledger of convenience. The voice code had been a door. The door had been a tool. What she did with it was not about redemption for herself. It was about the small mathematics of saving a life. Jackson's recovery, when it came, was not a clean arc. He had nights of nightmares and bright morning surges of panic. He had the kind of flashbacks that would become the soft center of veteran support groups he would later attend. But he had also the coin and the note, and sometimes that small object was all the world needed to prove that someone else had decided his life was worth protecting. One afternoon at Walter Reed, months after his release, someone placed a small envelope on Jackson's bedside table. He opened it with the cautious ritual of a man who had been surprised by gifts before. Inside was a photograph, grainy but many-layered. It showed a woman with a scarf wrapped around her neck, standing at an international airport with a battered bag. Someone had taken the photo from a distance. The image had the intimacy of a stolen thing. On the back, in the same block handwriting, the words, "Keep breathing. Ghost." Jackson laughed then, a wet, exhausted sound that turned into a sob. He put the coin against the photograph and felt the two objects stitch a seam across time. He did not try to find her. That would have required a bureaucracy he no longer trusted. That would have demanded exposure she had refused. Instead, he sat with the coin and the photograph and let the small, private salvation hold. Mercy General continued to function under its fluorescent lights, the world revolving on the axis of small emergencies and bureaucracy. Dr. Sterling wrote a paper that would become boring in a year. Brenda continued to supervise with an eye that had softened. Captain Miller ordered one more file closed and kept his mouth shut about a few things. The mercenaries were charged, tried, and quickly forgotten by the public that eats outrage the way it eats breakfast. Holay's fall was debated in private memos that tried to reconcile liability with leadership. In the end, papers were shuffled to tidy corners, and everyone returned to the daily business of keeping people alive. But the memory of that night sat in the staff's bones like a small, stubborn ache, a story they told in soft tones to new hires who could not imagine being shoved into the seam between policy and personhood. Aurora's coin was a talisman in those whispers, a small metallic proof that quiet people could be dangerous in the best way, dangerous to injustice. The phrase, "dead to command," acquired new life as a private joke, a warning, an instruction manual for the morally tired. And in the quiet streets beyond Mercy General, Aurora lived in obscurity by intention. She did not vanish because she wanted to be mythologized. She left because she had learned the price of living in the light. To a person who had been useful and then written aside, invisibility was sometimes the only way to keep being useful at all. There is a question that lives at the center of choices like hers. When systems betray people, is the right response to trust the same system or to slip through its cracks to save a life? Aurora's answer was practical and moral at once. She chose the crack. Months faded into seasons. Jackson's nightmares receded into a new life that sometimes felt ordinary. He kept the coin in a small pouch near his locker. When night came and the city's noise thinned, he would take it out and roll it between his fingers, feeling the warmened metal as proof that someone named Ghost, had chosen to step between his wreckage and possible oblivion. Once by the side of a lake, he whispered the phrase that had become the hinge of his recovery, "Still here." It tasted like a confession and a benediction. He meant it for himself, but in the breath of that quiet, he imagined Aurora somewhere else saying it, to keep herself from being swallowed by the world. The city had its stories. Some people made them into pamphlets and hashtags. Others kept them in their pocket like small emergency tools. Aurora's story would be the latter. She would pass like a rumor through hospital corridors, a coin in the hand of someone who knew that the cost of doing what was right is often the price of anonymity. If there is a moral at the end of a story that refuses tidy endings, it is this: appearances can be deceiving. The quiet ones sometimes carry the loudest courage. Aurora had been called dead to command, and that phrase had been meant as erasure. She turned it into a lifeline. She opened a door with a voice and a coin and used what she found not for revenge, but for rescue. She disappeared not because she wanted to shun the world, but because she had learned that sometimes saving a life requires you to be the shadow who moves unseen. In the hush after everything, when the nights are loud enough to bring the memory back up, people still ask, did she do the right thing? Did the cost of her invisibility justify the lives saved? If you have a thought, if you find yourself on one side of the ledger or the other, did she choose rightly? Leave it in the small place where people share opinions. The question is the point. The conversation is the mercy. They said she was dead to the command. She answered with a voice. She unlocked a base with a phrase and used what she found to keep a life from being handed over to men who would have made it a number. In that choice, she was alive, complicated, expensive, and utterly human.